That's what you owe us." The chilling demand dropped like an execution order at my front door as my mother, Evelyn Bennett, resurfaced after 14 years of utter silence. Nora Bennett stood frozen at 32, staring in sheer horror as she held a leather folder like a weapon. I had never given her my address, never told her I bought a house yet. She looked right past me, appraised my home at $235,000, and flipped open a file displaying a horrifying figure that turned my blood to ice. $170,000. Your father and I are ready to collect, Evelyn declared with sickening calm, shattering my 14-year delusion of escape and exposing the terrifying truth that my family had been silently keeping score the entire time. Before I take you back to the night I left home, I want you to stay with me until the very end, because the reason my mother believed I owed her $170,000 was something I never imagined would follow me into adulthood. If you've ever had a family member make you feel guilty for setting boundaries, you may understand more of this story than you expect. And if stories about family betrayal, healing, and finding your own strength speak to you, please consider subscribing and turning on the notification bell. You never know when the next story might remind you of something you needed to hear. The morning my mother came back after 14 years, I was standing in my kitchen making coffee when someone knocked on my front door. It was just after 9. I remember that because I had a client call scheduled for 10, and I was already thinking about the spreadsheet I needed to finish before then. It was an ordinary Wednesday in my ordinary life. Then I opened the door, and everything I had spent 14 years trying to leave behind was standing on my porch. Nora. My mother said my name as if she had seen me yesterday. Margaret Bennett looked older, of course. Her hair was shorter and almost completely gray, and there were deeper lines around her mouth. But her eyes were exactly the same, measuring, calculating, taking inventory. I didn't open the door any wider. "Mom," she smiled. "Look at you." I didn't know what to say. 14 years without a phone call. 14 birthdays. 14 Christmases. 14 years in which I had learned how to live without hearing her voice. And now she was standing outside my house like she had simply misplaced me and finally found me again. My eyes moved past her. My father Thomas was sitting in the driver's seat of a sedan parked along the curb. He didn't get out. He didn't wave. He just stared straight ahead. "How did you find me?" I asked. Margaret gave a small laugh. "Nora, everything is public these days. My address, property records, my business public registration." She said it casually, almost proudly. That answer made my stomach tighten. She hadn't come looking for her daughter. She had researched a person. I noticed she was holding a dark leather folder against her chest. "What's that?" I asked. "Something we need to discuss." I glanced toward my father again. He still wouldn't look at me. Margaret stepped closer to the door. "May I come in?" "No." The answer came out faster than I expected. Her smile tightened. "You're still angry. I'm cautious." She looked past me into the hallway. "Nice house." I didn't respond. She knew the house was mine. She knew when I bought it. She knew the purchase price. And apparently she knew something else because she opened the folder and removed several neatly typed pages. At the top were the words, "Family Property Agreement." "What is this?" I asked. "An arrangement that should have been made years ago." She held the document toward me. "I didn't take it." "You bought this house for $170,000, she said. "That's correct. And it's worth approximately $235,000 now." I stared at her. "How do you know that I know enough?" Then she said the sentence that made absolutely no sense. "We're willing to let you transfer it to us for the original $170,000. I almost laughed. "You're willing to let me sell my house to you. We're giving you a fair opportunity." "Why would I sell my house?" Margaret's expression became impatient. "Because the money belongs with the family." "What money?" She pointed at the document. "The $170,000. I felt my pulse begin to climb. "You think I owe you $170,000? Not just me, your father too." For what? She looked genuinely surprised by the question. "For raising you." There it was. 14 years had passed and somehow we had landed right back at the same kitchen table. Only now the number wasn't $40 a week. It was $170,000. I haven't signed anything I said. You don't need to make this difficult. I'm not signing this. Nora. Her voice dropped. Your grandmother's money helped you buy that house. I froze. Grandma's money was left to me. It came from the family. No. It came from Eleanor. My mother closed the folder. You're being emotional. And you're asking me to sell my home because you think I owe you money. We raised you. You charged me for room and board when I was 14. Her expression didn't change. Yao benefited from everything we provided. I couldn't believe we were standing on my porch having this conversation after 14 years of silence. I am not selling my house. Margaret stared at me for several seconds. Then something changed in her face. The warmth disappeared completely. We're not asking. My hand tightened around the edge of the door. Then what are you doing? She looked directly into my eyes. We're collecting. Then she turned and walked toward my father's car. My father finally looked at me through the windshield. For 1 second I thought he might say something. He didn't. The car pulled away, leaving me standing there with the folder in my hands. I looked down at the first page again. $170,000. 14 years ago I had left home because I couldn't afford to keep paying my mother for the privilege of being her daughter. Now she had found me again. And this time she believed she had finally found something worth collecting. The leather folder my mother left behind brought back memories I had spent years trying not to organize. That was the strange thing about being an accountant. My entire adult life had been built around numbers, records, receipts, and evidence. I trusted documents because documents didn't change their stories depending on how angry someone was. But my mother's records had always been different. They didn't simply record money. They recorded what she believed people owed her. When I was 8 years old, I first noticed the green notebook. It was small, about the size of a paperback book, with a faded green cover and a black elastic band around it. My mother kept it beside her purse on the kitchen table. I thought it was a grocery notebook. Sometimes I saw her writing in it while she drank coffee. I never thought much about it. Then one afternoon I saw my name. Nora Wintercoat, $46. I remember asking, "What's that?" My mother looked up. "Nothing you need to worry about." As a child, I accepted that answer. Over the next few years I began seeing more entries: shoes, school supplies, lunch money, prescription medicine, a field trip, a haircut, a birthday dress. Every expense had a number beside it. I assumed this was normal. We weren't rich. My parents lived carefully. My mother often said that every dollar mattered, and I believed she was simply teaching me responsibility. What I didn't understand was that she wasn't keeping track of household spending. She was keeping track of me. By the time I was 14, the notebook had become part of our household routine. That year, I got my first job at a small grocery store. I remember coming home after my first shift with my feet aching and my first paycheck folded carefully inside my jacket. I was proud of it. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I put the money on the kitchen counter. "Mom, look." She picked it up and counted it. "Good." I smiled. "I'm going to save most of it." She looked at me. "You'll contribute $40 a week." I thought I had misunderstood her. "For what, room and board?" I laughed because it sounded ridiculous. "I'm 14. You're working. I'm still your daughter." She opened the green notebook. "And you're still living here." Then she wrote something down. $40 every Friday. The next Friday, I gave her $40. She counted it and wrote a receipt. I remember staring at that piece of paper. Room and board, $40. Paid. "Why do I need a receipt?" I asked. "So we both know what you've paid." That answer seemed reasonable at the time. The following week I paid again, then again. Soon every Friday had a ritual. I came home from work, handed over $40, and watched my mother write it down. Sometimes she reminded me of other expenses. "Your shoes were $32. Your prescription was $12.50. Your school trip cost $18. She didn't ask me to pay those amounts immediately. She simply recorded them. That was what made me nervous. I started wondering what else was in that notebook. I began watching her whenever she opened it. If my father bought me something, she sometimes asked how much it cost. If I needed a new jacket, she knew the price. If I asked for something at the grocery store, she remembered the number. I learned to stop asking. I learned to calculate before I spoke. That was probably the first real lesson I learned from my mother about money, although it wasn't the lesson she intended to teach me. Money could provide security, but it could also become a weapon when someone used it to create fear. At 14, I didn't have the language for that. I only knew that I felt relieved whenever the notebook was closed. I also began keeping my own little record. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted to know how much I was giving away. $40 a week was a lot to me. I worked for every dollar. I stocked shelves, cleaned aisles, and stood at the register until my legs hurt. Then I handed part of it to my mother because she told me that was what responsible children did. I didn't realize I was being trained to see myself as a debtor. Years later, when Margaret stood on my porch asking for $170,000, she would point to the cost of raising me as if it were a financial account that had simply been allowed to grow. But the truth was that the balance had started long before I understood what a balance meant. It had started with a green notebook, a 14-year-old girl, and $40 every Friday. My grandmother's house was the first place where I learned that love could exist without a receipt. I didn't understand how important that was when I was young. I only knew that whenever I walked through Eleanor Bennett's front door, my shoulders seemed to relax. Grandma never asked what I had earned that week. She never asked how much money I had saved. She didn't care if I arrived with $5 in my pocket or 5 cents. She just opened the door and said, "There's my girl." Sometimes I went there after work. Sometimes I went because I didn't want to go straight home. One Saturday afternoon, I arrived exhausted and hungry. Grandma looked at me for about 3 seconds before saying, "Sit down." She put meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans on the table. I started eating quickly. "Slow down," she said, laughing. "Nobody's going to take it." I smiled, but then I noticed the slice of pie sitting beside my plate. I hesitated. Grandma noticed. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." "Then eat." I looked at the pie. "How much?" She frowned. "How much what?" "The pie." She stared at me for a second, and then her expression softened. She sat beside me. "Oh, Nora." She took my hand. "You're not a bill, sweetheart. You're a girl." I didn't know what to say. I remember looking down at our hands. "Mom says things cost money." Grandma nodded slowly. "Things do. Then what's wrong with knowing what things cost? Nothing." She paused. "But people aren't things." That sentence stayed with me. At the time, I still defended my mother in my own head. Margaret wasn't cruel all the time. She worked hard. She cooked. She kept the house running. She worried about bills. She had survived things I hadn't. I knew some of her history, but not all of it. As I got older, Grandma told me more. Margaret had been 19 when her father died. The family had very little money. My mother had wanted to become a nurse, but that dream disappeared when she had to help support her mother and younger sister Susan. She had learned very early that money could vanish, that people could need things, and that someone had to keep track of every dollar. "Your mother learned survival," Grandma once told me. "She never learned how to stop surviving." I thought about that for a long time. It explained some things. It didn't excuse them. That distinction became important to me later. Understanding why someone hurts you doesn't mean you have to volunteer to be hurt again. Margaret had grown up believing that every sacrifice created an obligation. If she gave something, she expected something back. If she suffered, someone else eventually had to suffer too. Maybe that's why the green notebook mattered so much to her. It wasn't just about money. It was proof that her sacrifices had value. But there was something she never understood. A child cannot consent to being born. A child cannot negotiate the terms of being raised. Food, shelter, medicine, school, and basic care are responsibilities. Parents accept when they bring a child into the world. They aren't loans. I didn't have those words at 14 or 18. I only had a feeling that something was wrong. Grandma Eleanor gave that feeling a name. "You're not a bill." Every time I visited her after that, I listened for evidence of the opposite. There never was any. If she bought me dinner, she didn't record it. If she gave me $20 for gas, she didn't ask me to repay it. If I helped clean her house, she thanked me, as if I had done her a kindness, not as if I had reduced some imaginary debt. That was the first time I experienced family without keeping score. And years later, when my mother claimed that Grandma's money belonged to the family, I would finally understand why that claim hurt so much. Eleanor had spent her entire life teaching me that love wasn't a ledger. Margaret had spent mine trying to convince me that it was. I just hadn't yet realized which lesson I would carry into adulthood. By the time I turned 18, I had become very good at doing mental math. I knew how much I earned each week. I knew how much went to my mother. I knew how much I could hide in a savings account without her noticing. I also knew exactly how much community college would cost. I had worked hard because I believed education was my way out. I didn't dream of becoming rich. I wanted a stable career, a small apartment, and enough money that nobody could ever tell me I owed them my future. I thought 18 would be the beginning of that life. Instead, it became the night everything broke. A few weeks before graduation, I brought home information about community college. I placed the brochure on the kitchen table. "I'm going to apply." My mother glanced at it. "No." One word. No discussion. I thought she hadn't understood me. "I can work while I go." "You're going to work full-time." "I can do both." "No." She opened the green notebook. That notebook seemed to appear whenever she needed to remind me who controlled the conversation. "You're 18 now," she said, "which means it's time you started paying back what you've been given." I stared at her. "I've been paying you for 4 years. $40 a week isn't enough." "Enough for what?" She turned several pages. There were numbers everywhere. Food, housing, clothing, medical care, school expenses, utilities. I felt my face grow hot. "You're charging me for raising me. I'm asking you to contribute. You said I owed you. You do." My father was in the next room. I could hear the television, but he wasn't watching it anymore. "Dad," I called. He didn't answer. I looked back at my mother. "How much what? How much do I owe?" She closed the notebook halfway. "We're still calculating." "Then calculate it. There's no need to be dramatic. If I owe you money, tell me how much." I remember how quiet the room became. I was desperate for a number. Any number. $10,000, 20,000, even 50,000. If there was a final amount, I could work toward it. I could make a plan. I could eventually say, "We're even." But my mother wouldn't give me that possibility. "Your raising balance is ongoing," she said. "What does that mean?" "It means you don't get to walk away after 18 years and pretend you didn't receive anything." I stared at her. Suddenly, the $40 every Friday made sense. It had never been the point. The point was to teach me that I was always behind. Even if I paid one amount, another could be added. Even if I worked harder, the balance could grow. There was no finish line because she controlled the ledger. "I want to go to college," I said quietly. "You can go later. When you can afford it." "How can I afford it if you're taking most of my paycheck?" She looked at me as though I had just proven her point. "That's adulthood." I shook my head. "No, that's a trap." My mother's expression hardened. "You have no idea what we've sacrificed for you." Maybe she was right about one thing. I didn't know everything she had sacrificed. But I also knew something she didn't seem willing to understand. Sacrifice does not create ownership over another person's life. Parents can give everything they have to their children and still have to let those children become separate human beings. I wish my father had said that. I wish he had stood up. Instead, he remained silent. My mother closed the notebook and pushed it toward me. "Think carefully before you make another selfish decision." I looked at the green cover. 4 years of $40 payments, years of expenses, years of numbers, and still no final balance. That's when I understood that I wasn't dealing with a debt. I was dealing with a system. As long as I accepted the premise that I owed her, she would always have another number, another sacrifice, another reason I wasn't free yet. I went upstairs that night and sat on my bedroom floor. For the first time, I didn't calculate what it would cost to leave. I calculated what it would cost to stay, and that number frightened me more. I left home on a Thursday night with 2 bags, one birth certificate, and exactly $1,100 hidden inside an envelope. I remember the amount because I counted it 3 times before putting it in my backpack. $100 wasn't freedom. It wasn't security. It wasn't enough to guarantee anything. But it was money I had earned, saved, and kept for myself. And that night it felt like the only thing I truly owned. The argument with my mother had started again after dinner. I had already made my decision. I wasn't going to give her most of my paycheck. I wasn't giving up college. And I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life trying to reach a balance she refused to define. "I'm not doing it," I said. Margaret stared at me. "Doing what? Paying you forever?" Her face changed immediately. "After everything we've done for you, you raised me because you were my mother, and that means nothing. It means you were supposed to raise me." She slammed her palm against the table. "You ungrateful girl." I flinched, but I didn't take it back. "I'm leaving." Silence filled the kitchen. My father finally came into the room. I looked at him with the last bit of hope I had left. "Dad, please." He looked exhausted, not angry, not shocked, just tired. And then he said the sentence I would remember for the rest of my life. "Just give her what she wants, Nora. It's easier." I stared at him. "Easier for who?" He looked down. He didn't answer. My mother crossed her arms. "See, your father understands." Something inside me broke then, but it wasn't the kind of break that makes noise. It was quieter. It was the moment I stopped waiting for someone to rescue me. I went upstairs. I pulled a duffel bag from the closet and started packing. 2 pairs of jeans, shirts, underwear, socks, my sneakers, a jacket, my toothbrush. I took my birth certificate from the drawer because I knew I would need it. Then I found the envelope beneath the loose floorboard. $1,100. I put it inside my backpack. I stood in my room and looked around. There were photographs on the wall, school certificates, a small stuffed animal Grandma Eleanor had given me years earlier. For a few seconds I wondered if leaving meant I was throwing away my family. Then I remembered something Grandma had said. People weren't bills. I wasn't a debt. I was a person. At around midnight, I carried my bags downstairs. The house was dark. I stopped outside my parents' bedroom. I wanted my father to open the door. I wanted him to say, "Don't go." I wanted my mother to suddenly realize that whatever she thought she was collecting was about to cost her a daughter. Nothing happened. So I opened the front door. The cold night air hit my face. I stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind me. I walked to the bus stop with my backpack over one shoulder and my duffel bag in my hand. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. I had no apartment, no full-time career, no guarantee that college would work out. I didn't even know exactly where I would sleep the next week. I only knew I couldn't go back inside that house. When the bus arrived, I climbed aboard. I sat near the window and held my backpack against my chest. As the bus pulled away, the streetlights passed across the glass. I looked back at the town where I had grown up. I expected to feel relief. Instead, I felt terrified. I cried quietly because I was 18 and suddenly responsible for everything. I wasn't leaving because I had won. I wasn't leaving because I was stronger than my parents. I was leaving because I had finally understood that staying would cost me something I could never earn back. My childhood, my education, my independence, maybe even my sense of who I was. I had spent years doing the math my mother taught me to do. That night, I finally changed the equation. I had done the math. I couldn't afford to be their daughter anymore. So I decided I would learn how to be Nora Bennett instead. I left that town with $100 hidden in my backpack, 2 bags of clothes, my birth certificate, and a fear so big it felt like another person sitting beside me on the bus. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a college acceptance letter, a career, or anyone waiting for me at the other end. I only knew one thing: I couldn't go back. For the first few weeks, survival became my entire schedule. I found a cheap room in a house where the landlord barely asked questions, and I took the first job I could get at a diner. I waited tables during the day, carried trays until my wrists hurt, and counted every dollar of my tips before I went to sleep. A few months later, I added stocking shelves at a grocery store because the diner didn't give me enough hours. Then I picked up night shifts whenever someone called out. I learned how exhausting freedom could be. There were mornings when I sat on the edge of my mattress, too tired to stand, wondering whether leaving had been a mistake. At least when I lived with my parents, I had a roof. But then I remembered the green notebook. I remembered my mother's handwriting beside every expense, every receipt, every dollar I had supposedly cost her. And I knew I had traded one kind of poverty for another. I was poor in money, but for the first time my choices belonged to me. At 20, I enrolled at a community college. I couldn't afford to attend full-time, so I took classes around my work schedule. One accounting course changed everything. Numbers made sense to me in a way people often didn't. A balance sheet didn't guilt-trip me. A ledger didn't change its rules depending on someone's mood. If the numbers were wrong, there was a reason. If something didn't balance, I could find it. My professor noticed and encouraged me to pursue accounting. For the first time, someone looked at something I was good at and didn't immediately ask what it was worth to them. I finished my certificate, then started taking small bookkeeping jobs. I wasn't making much, but I was building something. Slowly, clients began referring other clients. I moved into a better apartment. I replaced my worn-out shoes. I opened a savings account and watched the balance grow. Every little step felt enormous because nobody had handed it to me. Then I met Megan Parker. She owned a tiny bakery a few blocks from one of my clients' offices, and I started stopping there for coffee. Megan was the kind of person who could talk to a stranger for 5 minutes and make them feel like they'd known each other for years. One rainy afternoon, she noticed me staring at an envelope of receipts. "You always look like you're auditing the universe," she joked. I laughed before I could stop myself. That laugh mattered. It was the first time in years I had laughed without checking whether someone was angry. Megan became my friend slowly, then completely. She never asked what I owed my parents. She never asked how much money I made. When I couldn't afford dinner, she didn't make it a favor I needed to repay. She simply put another plate on the table. That confused me more than I wanted to admit. I had spent my childhood believing every kindness came with a balance. Megan quietly showed me otherwise. By 24, I had enough clients to work for myself. I wasn't rich, I wasn't even close. But I paid my bills, filed my taxes, and made every financial decision myself. Sometimes I still caught myself waiting for someone to tell me what I owed. No one did. And slowly, almost painfully, I began to understand that maybe I had never owed them my future in the first place. By 24, I had enough bookkeeping clients to stop working for other people. I rented a tiny office above a hardware store and painted the walls myself because paying someone else to do it felt irresponsible. The sign outside said Bennett Ledger Services. It wasn't glamorous. There was one desk, 2 filing cabinets, a second-hand printer, and a coffee maker that sounded like it was dying every morning. But when I turned the key in that door, I felt something I had never felt at home. Ownership. Not ownership of a building. Ownership of my life. I kept meticulous records. Every invoice had a copy. Every payment was documented. Every receipt went into a labeled folder. I kept digital backups and paper backups, and eventually I started keeping backups of the backups. Megan thought it was hilarious. One afternoon, she walked into my office carrying a box of pastries and stared at the wall of filing cabinets. "Nora, are you running an accounting business or preparing for the apocalypse?" she asked. I smiled. "You never know." "You absolutely do know," she said. "Nothing is happening. Nobody is coming after your receipts." I laughed, but I didn't tell her the truth. I wasn't afraid of receipts. I was afraid of being accused. Somewhere inside me was still that 18-year-old girl standing beside 2 packed bags while my mother explained that I had a balance to pay. I had learned something important in those years. When someone controls the story, facts can disappear very quickly. So I kept facts. I kept contracts. I kept bank statements. I kept tax returns. I kept proof of every major purchase. It wasn't healthy all the time. Sometimes I would spend an hour looking for a receipt for a $23 expense simply because the idea of losing a piece of evidence made my chest tighten. Megan noticed. "You know you're allowed to trust yourself, right?" she asked once. I looked at her and didn't know how to answer. Trusting myself sounded easier than it actually was. I had been raised to believe that someone else always knew better. My mother had called control responsibility. My father had called silence peace. I had spent years learning how to make myself smaller so other people wouldn't become angry. Accounting gave me another language. Numbers didn't shout. They didn't threaten to leave. They didn't rewrite yesterday's conversation. If $500 entered an account and $300 left it, the remaining $200 didn't suddenly become $700 because somebody was upset. That certainty comforted me. My business grew. I hired no employees at first because I wanted complete control over the work. I served small businesses, contractors, local shops, and a few self-employed professionals. I learned how to explain complicated financial matters in simple language. People trusted me because I didn't make them feel stupid for not understanding numbers. In a strange way, my past had taught me how to help people. I knew what it felt like to have money used as a weapon. I wanted my clients to understand their own finances so nobody could intimidate them with numbers. By the time I turned 25, Bennett Ledger Services was stable. I had savings. I had good credit. I had a growing client list. And I had something else I hadn't expected: peace. My family had been silent for 7 years. No calls, no letters, no messages through relatives. Nothing. I told myself that meant the chapter was closed. I was wrong about many things in my life, but that was one of the mistakes I would remember most. Because while I was carefully organizing every receipt in my office, someone from my past was preparing to open a ledger of her own. And I had no idea that one day she would put a price beside my childhood. The call came on a Sunday afternoon. I almost didn't answer because I didn't recognize the number. When I finally picked up, an older woman's voice said my name, Nora. My entire body went still. I knew that voice. It was my grandmother, Eleanor. For several seconds, neither of us said anything. I had imagined that moment more times than I could count, but none of those imaginary versions prepared me for the real thing. "How did you find me?" I finally asked. Eleanor laughed softly. "I'm your grandmother. I have my ways." I expected questions. Where had I been? Why had I left? How much money did I make? Was I married? Did I own anything? Instead, she asked, "Have you been eating properly?" I almost cried. It was such a simple question. Somehow it broke through every wall I had built. We talked for nearly an hour that first day. She told me she had tried to find me before but hadn't known where to look. She apologized for not doing more when I was younger. I told her she didn't have to apologize. The truth was, I didn't know what I wanted from her. I wasn't sure whether I wanted a grandmother or simply proof that someone in my family remembered I existed. Eleanor didn't push. She didn't demand forgiveness. She didn't tell me what I should feel. She simply kept calling. Every Sunday. Same time almost always. Sometimes we talked for 2 hours. Sometimes 10 minutes. She told me about her garden. I told her about my clients. She asked about Megan. She wanted to know whether I liked my apartment. Once she asked me what I was saving for. I hesitated before answering. A house someday. She didn't ask how much money I had. She said, "Then I hope you find one with a kitchen you love." That was it. No lecture, no calculation, no advice about what I owed her. Slowly I started telling her things I had never told anyone. I told her about leaving home. I told her about the $40 a week. I told her how my mother had called my childhood a balance sheet. Eleanor became quiet when I said that. Then she said, "Nora, your mother grew up believing love had to be earned." I didn't know what to say. Eleanor didn't defend Margaret. She didn't say my mother had good intentions. She simply explained that Margaret had lived through hardship and had never learned how to separate love from obligation. "That may explain her," Eleanor said. "But it doesn't excuse her." I wrote those words down later. I don't know why. Maybe because they gave me permission to understand my mother without forgiving what she had done. Over the next 2 years, our Sunday calls became part of my life. Eleanor never asked me to visit because she wanted something. She asked because she wanted to see me. When I finally drove to see her, she hugged me for a long time. Then she made chicken soup and complained that I looked too thin. There was no notebook on the kitchen table, no receipt, no calculation, just food, just warmth, just a grandmother happy to have her granddaughter sitting in her house. Before I left that evening, Eleanor looked at me and asked the question she would repeat many times after that. "Are you happy?" I told her I was trying to be. She smiled. "Then keep going." I didn't understand how important those words would become. I thought Eleanor had simply found me. I didn't know she was about to leave me something that would change the rest of my life. Eleanor died when I was 27. There are losses that arrive like storms, and there are losses that arrive so quietly you don't realize how much has disappeared until you reach for it. Losing her was the second kind. After the funeral, I drove home alone and sat in my car for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. Her voice was still in my head. "Are you happy? Keep going." I wanted to call her. I wanted to tell her about a difficult client. I wanted to hear her complain about my coffee. Instead, there was silence. I attended the funeral because I wanted to honor her, not because I wanted to reconnect with the rest of my family. Margaret was there. Thomas was there. Susan was there. Seeing them after so many years made my stomach tighten. Nobody asked me how I had been. Nobody asked whether I was okay. Margaret waited until after the burial when people had gone back inside before she approached me. "What are you planning to do with the family's money?" she asked. I stared at her. "What money?" She looked almost offended. "Mother's money." I realized then that she had already divided the estate in her mind. I didn't argue with her. I was too exhausted. "I don't know," I said. "I haven't even thought about it." Margaret narrowed her eyes. "Well, you should." That conversation stayed with me. A few days later, I received a call from the bank. They told me Eleanor had named me as the beneficiary of a payable on death account. The amount was $20,000. I asked them to repeat it. $20,000. For a moment I couldn't breathe. I had never known the account existed. Eleanor had apparently opened it years earlier and designated me directly. Because it was a payable on death account, the money transferred to me according to the beneficiary designation, rather than becoming part of the estate that would be distributed through probate. There was no family vote, no approval from Margaret, no division among relatives. It was Eleanor's decision documented in the account. I cried when I signed the paperwork, not because I suddenly felt rich. $20,000 wasn't going to transform my life overnight. It was because I understood what Eleanor had really given me: choice. She had spent years watching me build a life from nothing. She knew I wanted a house. She knew how hard I worked. Maybe she knew I still carried the fear that I could lose everything if someone decided I hadn't earned it. When the money arrived, I didn't spend it. I put it into a separate savings account. I told Megan about it. She hugged me. "She believed in you," Megan said. I nodded. Then Margaret called. Her first question wasn't how I was coping with Grandma's death. It wasn't whether I missed her. It was, "How much did you get?" I didn't answer immediately. Grandma left it to me. There was silence. Then Margaret said, "She should have discussed that with the family. It was her money." Margaret's voice hardened. "Family money is different." I felt something inside me close. I had heard that phrase before, even if she had never used those exact words. Family money, family sacrifice, family debt. Everything seemed to become collective whenever someone wanted something from me. I didn't tell Margaret how much the money meant to me. I didn't tell her I planned to use it someday for a house. I didn't tell her that for the first time I could imagine a front door that belonged to me. I simply said goodbye. For the next 2 years, I kept that $20,000 untouched. I continued working. I saved more. I built my business. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I carried Eleanor's final gift, like a quiet promise. I thought the money would help me build a future. I never imagined that one day my mother would look at that same $20,000 and claim it belonged to her. By the time I turned 29, I had saved enough to start looking seriously for a house. I had $20,000 from Eleanor sitting untouched in a separate account, and I had managed to save another $14,000 from my accounting business. For years, I had thought owning a home was something other people did. People with parents who helped with closing costs. People who had someone to call when the furnace broke. People who didn't calculate every purchase 3 times before making it. Then one Saturday morning, I found a listing on Willow Lane. The house wasn't impressive by wealthy standards. It was small, older, and needed some work. The kitchen cabinets were dated. The backyard was more dirt than grass. One bedroom had a window that needed replacing. But when I walked through the front door, I felt something I couldn't explain. It felt like mine before it legally was. The asking price was $170,000. I stared at the number on my phone and felt my heart pound. Megan came with me to see it a second time. She walked into the kitchen, looked around and said, "I can already picture you here." I laughed. "You mean surrounded by filing cabinets?" "Absolutely." I made an offer. The seller accepted after a short negotiation. Then came the part I had spent years preparing for: paperwork, loan documents, inspections, insurance, closing disclosures, numbers everywhere. For once, numbers weren't frightening, they were building something. My $20,000 from Eleanor became part of the down payment. My $14,000 in savings covered the rest of the down payment and closing-related costs. The remaining balance became my mortgage. I read every document carefully. I asked questions. I signed only when I understood what I was signing. Then the deed was recorded. I was a homeowner. I remember walking out of the closing office with the keys in my hand. They were so small. I had expected them to feel heavier. Instead, they felt almost weightless. Megan hugged me in this parking lot. I started crying before I could stop myself. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing," I said. "That's why I'm crying." I drove to Willow Lane alone that afternoon. I unlocked the front door and stood in the empty living room. No one was waiting to tell me what I owed. No one had a notebook open. No one was keeping score. I walked from room to room, touching the walls like I needed physical proof that I was really there. Then I unpacked one small box. Inside was a teacup that had belonged to Eleanor. It wasn't valuable. The porcelain was slightly worn, and there was a tiny crack near the handle. But Eleanor had used it every Sunday when I visited. I placed it on the windowsill in the kitchen. Sunlight came through the glass and caught the faded pattern on the cup. I stood there for a long time. I thought about the girl who had left home at 18 with $100. I thought about the waitress who counted tips in the bathroom, the college student who studied between night shifts, the young woman who had learned accounting because numbers stayed honest. And I thought about Eleanor, who had never once asked me to repay her love. I looked at the mortgage documents sitting on the counter. This time I understood exactly what I owed and exactly why I owed it. It was a mortgage. It had a contract. It had terms. It had an ending. It wasn't my childhood. It wasn't love. It wasn't my existence. I smiled and whispered something I had wanted to believe for most of my life. Paid in full. I didn't mean the mortgage. I meant something much deeper. I thought the debt my mother had spent years describing was finally behind me. I thought the $170,000 price on the house was simply the price of a house. I didn't know that years later my mother would stand on that same front porch holding a folder and tell me that $170,000 was not the price of my home at all. According to her, it was the price of what she believed I owed her. I used to think peace was supposed to feel exciting. After everything that happened when I was 18, I imagined that one day I would wake up and suddenly feel completely free. Instead, freedom arrived quietly. It looked like a mortgage payment made on time. It sounded like the washing machine running on a Saturday morning. It smelled like coffee in my own kitchen. By the time I was 29, the little house on Willow Lane had become more than property to me. It was proof that I had built something no one could simply take away. I worked hard, kept my accounting clients, and spent most evenings at home with my gray cat Jasper, who had developed the habit of following me from room to room as if he were checking whether I was still there. I planted flowers along the front walkway every spring. Some survived, some didn't. I learned not to take that personally. For 3 years, nothing happened. No calls from my mother, no letters from my father, no messages from Susan, no birthday cards pretending that 14 years of silence had been a misunderstanding. At first, I waited for them. Then I stopped. That was one of the strangest parts of healing. You don't always notice when you stop expecting someone to come back. One day you simply realize you're no longer listening for their footsteps. I became careful with my privacy, but I wasn't hiding. My business had a basic website. My name appeared in a few local directories. The county property records were public. My professional registration was public. Even the occasional photograph Megan posted of us at her bakery could be seen by anyone who knew where to look. I didn't think much about it. I certainly didn't imagine my mother sitting somewhere with a notebook piecing together my life from public records. But there were little things that bothered me in hindsight. One afternoon, Megan mentioned that someone had asked at the bakery whether I still lived on Willow Lane. She hadn't thought anything of it. Neither did I. Probably a client, I said. Another time I received a postcard addressed to my old apartment even though I hadn't lived there in years. It wasn't threatening, it wasn't even personal. I threw it away. Looking back, I wish I had paid more attention to the pattern. But peace makes you optimistic. When you've spent years preparing for the next crisis, ordinary days can feel so precious that you don't want to ruin them by searching for danger. I told myself my mother had moved on. Maybe she had remarried emotionally, even if not literally. Maybe she had accepted that I wasn't coming back. Maybe my father had finally convinced her to leave me alone. I wanted to believe that. More than that, I needed to believe it. Because if I kept expecting Margaret to return, then she still had a room in my mind. I didn't want to live there anymore. So I focused on my work. I helped small business owners understand their books. I advised people on taxes, budgets, payroll, and cash flow. I liked helping people see numbers clearly because numbers had always made sense to me. They didn't change their story depending on who was telling it. 2 plus 2 didn't become 5 because someone was angry. A receipt didn't become a gift because someone wanted it to. A balance either existed or it didn't. I didn't realize how important that belief would become. Then one Tuesday morning, I noticed a dark SUV parked across the street. I saw it through my kitchen window while pouring coffee. It wasn't unusual enough to scare me. Plenty of people parked on Willow Lane. I went about my morning. Around noon it was gone. 2 days later, another vehicle sat there for almost an hour. I noticed it only because the driver remained inside. I told myself I was imagining things. Trauma has a strange way of teaching you to distrust both the world and yourself. I didn't know then that someone had been watching my life from a distance. I didn't know that my mother already knew the approximate value of my house. I didn't know she knew where I worked, what business name I used, or how long I had owned the property. I certainly didn't know that somewhere, perhaps in the same green notebook from my childhood, she had begun adding numbers again. I thought my past was behind me. I was wrong. My quiet life hadn't ended yet. But something had already started moving toward my front door. The knock came at 9:17 on a Wednesday morning. I remember the time because I was standing in my kitchen with my laptop open, reviewing a client's quarterly numbers. Jasper was asleep on the chair beside the window. I almost ignored the knock. Then it came again. 3 slow taps. Not urgent, not hesitant, deliberate. I walked to the front door and looked through the glass panel. For several seconds I couldn't breathe. My mother was standing on my porch. Margaret Bennett looked older than she had in my memories, but not softer. Her hair was shorter. There were more lines around her eyes. She wore a beige coat and held a dark leather folder against her chest. Behind her at the curb sat a familiar-looking sedan. My father was in the driver's seat. I hadn't seen either of them in 14 years. My hand remained on the doorknob. I opened it only a few inches. "Mom," I said. She smiled. "Nora, look at you." That sentence made something cold move through me. Not hello, not I missed you, not I'm sorry. Just look at you, as if she had walked away yesterday and returned to inspect the result. How did you find me? I asked. She gave a small shrug. Everything is public. I stared at her. She continued as if we were discussing the weather. Your business registration, county property records, professional listings. It wasn't difficult. My stomach tightened. She knew too much. She knew my address. She knew my business. She knew I owned the house. And judging by the confidence in her voice, she knew exactly how much it was worth. Why are you here? I asked. She lifted the folder. We're here to settle something. I looked toward the car. My father didn't move. Your father and I have been very patient, Margaret said. I almost laughed. Patient. 14 years of silence suddenly counted as patience. I haven't heard from you in 14 years. That's not the point. She opened the folder and pulled out several typed pages. Across the top was a heading that made my pulse jump: Family Property Agreement. What is this? I asked. An arrangement that should have been made years ago. I didn't sign anything. You don't need to be difficult. She held the document toward me. Your house is worth approximately $235,000 now. I looked at her. Okay. You purchased it for $170,000. Yes. That's a difference of $65,000. She said the number slowly, as if she expected me to recognize it. I didn't. So that's the amount remaining from what you owe. My fingers tightened around the door. Owe you the family. She said the word with absolute certainty. Then she pointed toward the page. Your raising balance. For a moment I thought I had misheard her. My what? The cost of raising you. Food, clothing, medical expenses, school, housing, everything your father and I paid while you were growing up. My mouth went dry. The green notebook flashed through my mind. I hadn't seen it in 14 years, but suddenly I could picture the cover. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. She turned another page. The house is the cleanest way to resolve it. You can sell it to us for $170,000. We'll assume responsibility for the property, and the family balance will be considered settled. I stared at the folder. You're asking me to sell my house for what I paid for it. I'm offering you a fair family solution. You haven't seen me in 14 years. Her expression hardened. That doesn't erase what we gave you. Then she said the sentence that made everything suddenly make sense. Your grandmother's money was family money. I felt my chest tighten. Eleanor's $20,000. The money she had deliberately placed in my name. The money that had helped me buy this house. Margaret wasn't simply asking for money. She was rewriting the past so that everything Eleanor had given me could become another piece of evidence against me. Grandma gave that money to me, I said. She was part of this family. She chose me as the beneficiary. She should have chosen differently. There it was, the truth beneath everything. Margaret didn't believe Eleanor had the right to give me something without her permission. She believed every resource that had ever moved through our family belonged to her. Even love had to pass through her hands before it reached someone else. I looked at the papers again. My name was typed neatly across the first page. My address was correct. The purchase price of my house was correct. The estimated value was close enough to make my skin crawl. Someone had done homework. This wasn't an emotional visit. It was a prepared transaction. I'm not signing this, I said. Margaret's smile disappeared. You should think carefully. I have. Then you're making a mistake. She closed the folder. We're not here to argue, Nora. I looked at my father sitting silently in the car. 14 years had passed, and he still couldn't look me in the eye. My mother held the folder between us like a bill from an accountant. And for the first time in my adult life, I understood something terrifying. She hadn't come back because she missed her daughter. She had come back because she had finally found something she believed she could collect. I kept the door open for another few seconds after Margaret finished speaking. I don't know why. Maybe some part of me was still waiting for the mother I had spent 14 years secretly hoping would return. Maybe I wanted her to put this folder down and say I'm sorry. Maybe I wanted her to admit that the whole thing was a misunderstanding. Instead, she stood there waiting for me to surrender. I'm not selling you my house, I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Margaret blinked once. Think about what you're saying. I already have. Nora, don't make this harder than it has to be. You came to my house asking me to give up my home because you believe I owe you money for being raised. It's not that simple. It sounds pretty simple to me. Her jaw tightened. That was when I saw it. The disappointment wasn't the disappointment of a mother whose daughter had rejected her. It was the frustration of someone whose plan had met resistance. You have always been stubborn, she said, and you have always confused stubbornness with independence. Maybe because you taught me that asking for permission was expensive. Her face changed. For a second I saw the old Margaret, the one who could make me feel guilty with a single look. I was 18 again, standing in our kitchen with a backpack beside me, while my father told me it would be easier to just give her what she wanted. But I was not 18 anymore. I was 32. I owned the house behind me. I had a business. I paid my taxes. I had survived without them. Most importantly, I had spent 14 years learning that fear was not the same thing as obedience. I'm not signing anything, I repeated. Margaret lowered the folder. Then you have 30 days. I stared at her. 30 days for what? To reconsider. And if I don't? She looked directly into my eyes. Then we'll proceed. My stomach dropped. Proceed with what? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced toward my house as though she were already imagining it without me inside. We're collecting what is owed. The word hit me harder than it should have. Collecting, I asked. She gave me a thin smile. You heard me. You can't just decide I owe you money. We'll see. Then she turned toward the driveway. I looked at my father. Dad. He finally raised his eyes. For one brief second, I thought he might say something. Anything. He looked tired, older than I remembered. His lips parted. Nora. He stopped. Please, I said. Just tell me you don't agree with this. He looked down at his hands. Your mother has thought this through. That was all. Somehow that hurt more than if he had yelled at me. Margaret walked back toward the car. Before getting in, she turned around and said, 30 days, Nora. Don't force us to take the next step. Then they drove away. I stood on the porch until the car disappeared around the corner. Only then did I realize I was shaking. I carried the folder inside and placed it on my kitchen table. Jasper jumped down from his chair and sniffed it suspiciously. I know, I whispered. I don't like it either. I opened the documents again. The first page listed my name, address, property details, and purchase price. The second page contained a calculation of what Margaret called my raising balance. The numbers weren't random. They were organized, categorized, almost like the old notebook. There were references to the year I left home. There were amounts that appeared to correspond with expenses from my childhood. I felt sick. She had been keeping these numbers for years, maybe decades. But there was something else. The property valuation was recent. Too recent. I had purchased the house for $170,000 3 years earlier. The current estimated value of $235,000 wasn't information someone could have guessed casually. Someone had checked. Someone had researched the property. Someone had assembled documents. Someone had decided that after 14 years of silence, my home was worth coming back for. I called Megan. She answered on the second ring. Hey. What's wrong? I couldn't immediately speak. My mother found me. There was a pause. Margaret. Yes. Oh, Nora. Her voice changed instantly. What happened? I told her everything. When I finished, Megan was silent for a moment. She came prepared. Very. Then this wasn't spontaneous. I looked at the folder. That's what scares me. Megan didn't tell me what I wanted to hear. She didn't say, don't worry, it'll be fine. She simply said, save everything. That was Megan. She never confused comfort with denial. I will, I said. After I photographed every page. I scanned every document. I created a digital folder and backed it up twice. Then I sat alone at my kitchen table and stared at my mother's handwriting on one of the pages. I recognized it immediately. The same slanted letters. The same hard pressure on the pen. The same certainty that every number meant something I owed. For 14 years I had believed leaving home meant escaping the ledger. Now I understood that my mother had never stopped keeping one. She had simply been waiting for the right asset to appear beside my name. My house wasn't just a house to her, it was the largest number I had ever owned, and she had decided it belonged on her side of the page. I found Leah Carter through a referral from one of my professional contacts. Megan wanted me to call her immediately. I waited until the next morning because I had learned something important over the years. Panic makes expensive decisions. Fear tells you to move fast. Good judgment tells you to slow down just enough to see what you're actually dealing with. Leah's office was in a small brick building downtown, nothing flashy. Her waiting room had 2 chairs, a water dispenser, and a framed certificate on the wall. When she introduced herself, she didn't ask me whether I hated my mother. She didn't ask whether I wanted revenge. She simply said, "Show me everything." I handed her the folder. She read the first page without changing expression, then the second, then the third. "Did you sign this?" she asked. "No." "Did you ever verbally promise your mother the house?" "No." "Did your parents contribute money toward the purchase?" "No." "Did they pay your mortgage?" "No." "Any repairs, property taxes, insurance?" Number Leah nodded and made a note. "And the $20,000 from your grandmother?" It went directly into my account. The bank identified me as the payable on death beneficiary. She looked up. "Do you have documentation?" "Yes." "Good." I watched her turn another page. "This is an interesting document. That's what my mother calls a family property agreement." Leah studied it carefully. "It's not an executed agreement if you didn't sign it. So she can't just make me sign it." Leah gave me a measured look. "No one can make you voluntarily sign a contract simply by putting one in front of you." I exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. "Then I'm fine." Leah leaned back. I didn't say that. My relief disappeared. "Why not?" "Because legal strength and practical safety are 2 different things." She pointed to the folder. "Your mother appears to be claiming some form of financial interest based on alleged contributions, an alleged promise, and what she calls a family debt. Whether those theories survive scrutiny is another question. Do they based on what you've shown me? I don't see a clear written agreement giving her an ownership interest in your home, but I need to review the underlying records before I can tell you how serious this could become." She opened another document. "And if she files something against the property, that can complicate things, even if her ultimate claim is weak." I looked at her. "So she could cause trouble even if she's wrong?" "Absolutely." Leah's voice remained calm. "A weak case can still be expensive." That sentence stayed with me. I had spent most of my life believing that if you were right, eventually everything would work out. Leah was teaching me something less comforting and more useful. Being right didn't automatically protect your savings. It didn't stop paperwork. It didn't prevent sleepless nights. It didn't make other people tell the truth, and it certainly didn't erase legal fees. "What should I do?" I asked. "Don't contact your mother about the substance of the claim. Don't argue with her. Don't throw anything away. Save every message, every letter, every document you have." She paused. "And don't assume you know what she's going to do next." I nodded. She looked through my records again. "You have something your mother may not realize you have. What, your own history?" She tapped my bank statements, tax records, closing documents, and business records. "You've been keeping financial records for years." I almost laughed. Occupational hazard. In this case, it could be very helpful. When I left Leah's office, I didn't feel victorious. I felt sober. There was a difference. My mother had spent years turning family relationships into accounts payable. Now she was bringing that ledger into a system where documents mattered. I drove home and parked in the driveway. The house looked exactly as it had that morning. The flower beds needed watering. A package sat beside the front door. Jasper was watching me through the window. For a moment I stood there wondering how much of my life could be disturbed by one folder. Then my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. I didn't answer. A voicemail appeared seconds later. I listened. It was my Aunt Susan. "Nora, we need to talk. Your mother has told us what happened." I closed my eyes. The legal fight hadn't even begun, and the family story was already spreading. I understood then that Leah had been right. This wasn't simply about a house. It was about evidence, money, reputation, memory, and control. I had spent 14 years building a life outside my mother's ledger. Now I had to defend it without becoming trapped inside the same system that had hurt me. I put my phone down. Then I opened the banker box in my office. If my mother had her records, I had mine. And for the first time, I wasn't going to be ashamed of needing proof. The first person to call me was Susan. I had expected that. What I hadn't expected was how quickly the story had changed. "Nora, I don't understand what you're doing," she said the moment I answered. "What do you mean? Your mother says you refused to help your parents after everything they did for you." I closed my eyes. There it was. The version of the story had already arrived before I had. "Aunt Susan, that's not what happened." "Then tell me what happened." I almost started. I almost told her about the folder, about the house, about the $170,000, about the raising balance, about the green notebook. But then I heard the exhaustion in my own voice before I even spoke. I had spent 14 years learning that defending myself against Margaret could become another form of being controlled by her. So I took a breath. She came to my house with a document I didn't sign and demanded that I sell my house to her and Dad. Susan was quiet. She said the house was worth more now and that you owed them, yes, for raising you, yes. Susan sighed. "Nora, your parents sacrificed everything for you." I looked around my kitchen. My eyes landed on the little ceramic bowl Eleanor had given me years ago. "I know they fed me," I said quietly. "I know they bought clothes. I know they paid for things children need." "Then why are you acting like they did something wrong?" I didn't answer immediately. Because the answer was complicated. My parents had provided for me. That was true. They had also made me feel like every meal had an invisible price attached. Both things could be true. Providing for a child doesn't automatically create a debt, I finally said. Susan became defensive. "That's not what your mother is saying." "Then what is she saying?" "She's saying you took the family money, walked away, and built a life without ever looking back." The words stung because there was enough truth inside them to make the lie powerful. I had walked away. I had stopped calling. I had built a life without them. But I had done it because staying had become unbearable. And now my mother was turning the consequences of her own behavior into evidence against me. "What family money?" I asked. Susan hesitated. "Your grandmother's money. Grandma left that money to me. She was family. That doesn't make it Mom's money." Susan didn't respond. I knew then that this conversation wasn't going anywhere. "I don't want to fight with you," I said. "Neither do I." "Then please don't let Mom turn this into a family war." Susan's voice softened. "She's already telling everyone that you're refusing to make things right." After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for nearly 20 minutes. I felt angry, then guilty, then angry again. That emotional swing was familiar. Margaret had always been good at making guilt feel like responsibility. I knew I hadn't stolen anything. I knew I hadn't promised my parents my house. But hearing other people repeat the accusation made me question myself in ways facts never had. That was the danger. A false story doesn't have to be completely false to be effective. It only needs enough truth around the edges to make people fill in the rest themselves. I had left at 18. I had received Eleanor's money. I had bought a house. I had not returned to my parents. Every one of those facts was real. Margaret only had to rearrange them. By the weekend, another relative had texted me. Then another. Some were polite, others weren't. One message said, "Your mother deserves better." Another said, "Family shouldn't be treated like strangers." I read each one and put the phone down. Megan came over that afternoon with coffee and a box of pastries from the bakery. She found me sitting on the couch surrounded by documents. "How many?" she asked. "Messages." "Yeah. 7. She shook her head. "That's 7 more than she deserved." I smiled despite myself. "You don't have to defend me. I'm not defending you. I'm reminding you not to defend yourself to people who already decided the verdict." I looked at her. That sentence landed hard. Leah had warned me about the legal side. Megan understood the emotional side. My mother wasn't just trying to win a case. She was trying to make sure that if the case ever reached court, everyone around it already believed her. The story came first. The evidence came later. That night I opened my banker box again. I pulled out my college records, old pay stubs, bank statements, rent receipts, tax returns, and the closing documents from Willow Lane. I laid them across the floor in chronological order. For the first time, I saw my entire adult life as a timeline. 18 left home, 19 worked 2 jobs, 20 community college, 25 reconnected with Eleanor, 27 received the inheritance, 29 bought the house, 32 mother returned. There was nothing mysterious about it, no secret agreement, no family loan, no promise, just a woman who had built her own life one receipt at a time. I picked up my phone and looked at the latest message from Susan. I could have answered with anger. Instead, I typed one sentence. I hope someday you will want to hear the whole story before deciding what I owe. Then I put the phone away. I wasn't going to chase every accusation. I wasn't going to beg relatives to believe me. And I wasn't going to let my mother's version become my identity. She could tell the story first. I would make sure the truth survived long enough to tell the rest. The lawsuit arrived on a Thursday afternoon. I remember because I was finishing a tax return for one of my clients when the process server knocked on my door. He didn't look angry. He didn't look sympathetic either. He simply asked, "Are you Nora Bennett?" I knew immediately that something had happened. Yes. He handed me an envelope. "You've been served." My stomach dropped. I took it with both hands. The envelope felt heavier than it should have. I closed the door, walked into the kitchen, and stared at it for almost a full minute before opening it. My mother's name was on the paperwork. So was mine. I read the first page twice because my brain refused to process the words. Margaret Bennett was suing me. The claims were dressed in legal language, but the story underneath was painfully familiar. She alleged unjust enrichment. She alleged that I had benefited from financial contributions made by my parents. She alleged that I had made promises about repaying my family. She claimed that the money connected to my grandmother and the house created an interest that my parents were entitled to enforce. I sat down hard in the kitchen chair. "She actually did it," I whispered. Megan came over less than an hour later. She didn't say anything when she saw the papers spread across my table. She just pulled out the chair beside me and sat down. "Call Leah," she said. I did. Leah asked me to send every page. Then she told me not to contact Margaret. "Don't argue with her," she said. "Don't post anything. Don't threaten her. Don't explain yourself to relatives. Let the legal process speak." I tried to breathe normally. What happens now? We respond. We preserve evidence. We investigate the claims. Then she paused. There's something else. She had seen the property filing. A lis pendens had been recorded against my house. I knew enough about real estate to understand why that scared me, but Leah explained it carefully. It didn't transfer ownership to Margaret. It didn't mean she owned my home. But it put the public on notice that the property was involved in litigation. In practical terms, that could make a sale, refinance, or new financing extremely difficult because a title company or lender would want the dispute resolved or addressed. I looked toward the window. Willow Lane was quiet. A neighbor was walking a dog. A delivery truck rolled past. Everything outside looked completely normal. Inside my house, my entire sense of security had shifted. "Can she do this?" I asked. "She can file a claim," Leah said. "Whether she can prove it is another matter. But until then you have to deal with the consequences of the filing." That sentence frightened me more than I wanted to admit. I had spent years building financial stability. My house wasn't extravagant. It was a modest home worth around $235,000. But it represented safety. It represented the first place where I had never wondered whether someone could tell me to leave. Now a legal dispute was attached to it. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining the worst possibilities. What if the judge believed her? What if I lost the house? What if I had to sell it? What if the mortgage became impossible to manage because legal bills drained my savings? What if my clients found out? What if my mother somehow turned every document in my life into another accusation? Around 2 in the morning, I went downstairs and made tea. I stood in front of the window and looked at the little garden Eleanor had inspired me to plant. The flowers were barely visible in the darkness. I thought about what my mother had said at the door we're collecting. Now I understood the scale of what she meant. She wasn't asking anymore. She had turned the demand into a legal claim. The next morning, Leah called. Nora, I need you to start gathering everything. Everything related to your finances, your childhood payments, the inheritance, the house, your business, and any communication with your family. I almost laughed. That's going to be a lot. Good. Her answer was immediate. You are an accountant. This is where your habits become useful. I looked toward the banker box in my office. I had spent years saving receipts because numbers made me feel safe. Now those same pieces of paper might become the difference between a story and a fact. I drove to Leah's office that afternoon with the first box in my trunk. She looked at it and smiled faintly. You weren't kidding. I don't throw much away. That's about to become your best habit. I carried the box inside. For the first time since receiving the lawsuit, I felt something other than fear. It wasn't confidence. Not yet. It was preparation. My mother had decided to measure my entire life in dollars. Fine. If she wanted to make everything a ledger, then I would bring my own ledger to court. And unlike hers, mine would begin with facts I could prove. The green notebook came back into my life almost 20 years after I had last seen it. Leah called me on a Monday morning. We received another batch of discovery responses, she said. There's something you need to see. I drove to her office that afternoon. She had placed a small plastic evidence bag on the conference table. Inside was a green notebook. My chest tightened before I even touched it. I recognized the worn corners, the faded cover, the tiny white scratch near the bottom. For a second, I wasn't 32 anymore. I was 14, sitting at the kitchen table while my mother wrote numbers under the yellow light above us. I remembered the sound of the pen scratching across the paper. I remembered asking what she was doing. I remembered her saying, keeping things fair. I reached for the notebook. She submitted this, I asked. Leah nodded. As evidence. I almost smiled, but there was nothing funny about it. She really thinks this helps her. Apparently. I opened the first page. The handwriting was unmistakable. Margaret had recorded expenses from my childhood in careful columns. Clothing, shoes, food, medical expenses, school supplies, field trips. Then I turned another page. Room and board, $40 week. My fingers stopped. There it was, the first payment I had ever made to my own mother. I remembered being 14 and believing that $40 was a huge amount of money. I had been proud of earning it. I had thought I was helping. I hadn't understood that my mother was creating a permanent record. Page after page contained more numbers. Some were ordinary household expenses. Others were stranger. Interest, I whispered. Leah leaned closer. What's that? She added interest to certain amounts. Leah stared at the page for several seconds. When were these recorded? I looked at the dates. Some entries were from when I was 16. Others were from 17. I swallowed hard. I was still a minor. Leah nodded slowly. That's important. I kept turning pages. There were notes beside certain expenses paid for Nora. Still outstanding. To be recovered later. Family contribution. The words made my skin crawl. It was like looking at my childhood through the eyes of someone who had never seen me as a daughter. Only as an account. I remembered Eleanor's kitchen. The way my grandmother would put food in front of me without asking what it cost. The way she would hand me a sweater and say, "It looked like you." No calculation, no receipt, no balance, just love. I suddenly understood why Eleanor's words had stayed with me for so many years. Leah noticed. Are you okay? I'm okay. It wasn't completely true. I was angry. I was sad. I was embarrassed that something from my childhood had been turned into a legal exhibit. But beneath all of that was something else. Clarity. Margaret had believed the notebook proved that she had paid for my entire childhood. She wanted the court to see sacrifice. Instead, the notebook showed something much more complicated. It showed a parent tracking ordinary costs of raising a child as though those costs automatically became collectible debt. Leah turned another page. Did you ever agree to repay these amounts? No. Did you sign anything acknowledging them? No. Did she ever tell you that these were loans? I thought about it. She said I owed her, but I never agreed to a loan. Leah nodded. Then this notebook may be far more useful to us than she realizes. I looked at her. You mean, she just handed us the evidence? The words landed quietly. I stared at the green cover. For years I had thought that notebook was proof that I had been difficult, expensive, ungrateful. Now I was seeing it differently. It was a record of how Margaret thought. Every expense had to be balanced. Every sacrifice had to be repaid. Every act of care became leverage. And somehow she believed that made her fair. That night I took a photograph of the notebook's pages for my records. Then I sat alone in my office. I wasn't celebrating. A document could help my case and still break your heart. That was something I was learning throughout the lawsuit. Winning against someone you once wanted to love is not the same thing as defeating a stranger. I looked at the notebook one last time before closing the file. My mother had spent years writing down what she believed I owed her. She had no idea that by preserving every number she had also preserved the story of the way she had treated me. For the first time I wasn't afraid of the green notebook. I was ready to let it speak. After Leah showed me the green notebook, I went home and opened my own banker box. It sat on the bottom shelf of my office closet, exactly where I had kept it for years. The box was ugly brown and covered with old labels. There was nothing impressive about it. But when I lifted the lid, I realized I was looking at the evidence of my entire adult life. Pay stubs, tax returns, rent receipts, community college records, bank statements, old employment forms, copies of checks, business registrations, the documents from Eleanor's payable on death account, the closing statement from Willow Lane, mortgage paperwork, insurance records, property tax statements, and tucked between two old folders receipts my mother had written when I was 14. I pulled everything out and placed it on the floor. For a moment my office looked like a paper storm had passed through it. Megan stood in the doorway holding 2 coffees. "Wow," she said. "You've officially become your own version of the Library of Congress." I laughed. "Very funny." She handed me a coffee. "What are you looking for, my life?" She didn't ask what I meant. She knew. I started with the oldest documents. My first paycheck. I was 19. I had worked long shifts stocking shelves and had spent most of that money on rent, food, and school. Then came my community college records, tuition payments, course schedules, grades. I found an old note from an accounting professor who had written, "You have a natural eye for numbers." I smiled at that. It had been one of the first times an adult had looked at me and seen potential instead of an obligation. I kept sorting. Rent receipts from my first apartment, tax returns from my early 20s, bank statements showing the slow growth of my savings. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would impress anyone, just hundreds of small decisions. $50 saved here, $200 there. A weekend shift instead of a night out. A cheaper apartment. An extra client. A used laptop. A second-hand desk. My life hadn't been built through one lucky break. It had been built through repetition. Then I found the documents from Eleanor's account. The bank statement clearly identified the account and the payable on death beneficiary. My name. No ambiguity. No reference to Margaret. No reference to Thomas. I placed it beside the closing documents for the house. The $20,000 from Eleanor. The $14,000 I had saved. The mortgage that covered the rest of the $170,000 purchase price. The deed. The title documents. Everything connected. Megan looked at the papers. "That's your timeline." "Exactly." I thought about Margaret's notebook. Her ledger began with the question, What did I spend on Nora mine began with a different question. What did Nora do to build her life? That distinction mattered more than I could explain. My mother had recorded every meal as an expense. I had recorded every paycheck as progress. She saw childhood as an investment. I saw adulthood as responsibility. Two ledgers, two completely different stories. Then I found the old receipts she had given me for the $40 a week. I remembered handing her cash. She had always written a receipt. Back then I thought that meant I was being responsible. Now I realized it had created something else, evidence that I had paid her money while I was still a child. I looked at Megan. She kept these too. Of course she did. Why? Megan shrugged. Because she never forgot a number. I sat back. Neither did I. Megan smiled. Maybe that's why you're going to be okay. I wasn't sure about that. But I understood something important. My mother had spent decades collecting numbers to support the belief that I owed her. I had spent 14 years collecting numbers because I was terrified someone would tell me I hadn't earned my own life. The difference was that my records didn't prove I owed anyone. They proved I had survived. I scanned every document. Then I made digital backups and gave copies to Leah. She called me later that evening. This is very organized. I'm an accountant. I know. She paused. Nora, don't underestimate what this means. Your mother's claim depends heavily on her version of financial history. Your records give us dates, sources, transactions, and independent documentation. I looked at the piles on my floor. So we have a ledger too. You do. I smiled sadly. Hers says I owe her. Leah answered. Yours may show exactly how you became independent. After we hung up, I put the documents back into the box. I kept the green notebook separate. I didn't want the two records touching. One represented everything my mother believed I owed. The other represented everything I had done to become free. I closed my banker box and sat quietly for a while. For most of my life, I had thought numbers were neutral. They weren't. People could use numbers to control, shame, justify, or manipulate. But numbers could also protect the truth when memories became weapons. My mother had a ledger. I had one too. Hers counted the cost of raising me. Mine counted the cost of becoming myself. The deposition was held on a gray Tuesday morning. I arrived at the conference room 10 minutes early with Leah. My mother was already there. She sat beside her attorney with her hands folded neatly on the table. For a moment, I saw the woman from my childhood. The same posture, the same controlled expression, the same belief that if she kept herself calm enough, everyone else would eventually accept her version of reality. We took our seats. The court reporter explained the process. Questions would be asked. Answers would be recorded. Everything mattered. When Margaret was sworn in, I felt something strange. I had spent so many years imagining what I would say if I ever had the chance to confront her. Now I had the chance and I didn't want to scream. I wanted answers. Her attorney began with the basic facts. She confirmed that she was my mother. She confirmed that I had left home at 18. She confirmed that I had purchased Willow Lane for $170,000. Then Leah began asking about the alleged debt. Mrs. Bennet, what exactly do you believe Nora owes you? Margaret answered without hesitation. The cost of raising her. Did Nora ever sign a written agreement promising to repay those expenses? Not formally. Did you ever tell her that the expenses were loans? She knew she had responsibilities. Leah paused. That's not what I asked. Margaret's expression tightened. She knew children should contribute. Leah moved to the green notebook. Is this your handwriting? Yes. Did you keep this notebook during Nora's childhood? Yes. Why? Margaret answered, because I kept fair books. The phrase sounded almost rehearsed. Leah asked about the $40 weekly payments. Margaret confirmed that I had paid them beginning at 14. Why did you charge your 14-year-old daughter room and board? Margaret looked toward me briefly. She had a job. She was learning responsibility. Leah asked whether I had been a legal adult at the time. No. Did you consider the money a loan? It was part of what she owed the family. Then Leah asked something I wasn't expecting. Mrs. Bennet, tell me about your own childhood. Margaret's shoulders shifted. For the first time that morning she looked uncomfortable. She spoke slowly. Her father died when she was 19. Her family had very little money. Her mother struggled to keep the household going. Margaret had been preparing to study nursing, but she left that path. She started working. She gave money to her mother. She helped support Susan, who was still young. I paid my mother back every cent, Margaret said. The room became very quiet. Leah asked, "Why did you believe you had to pay her back?" Margaret looked at the table. "Because she raised me." "Did your mother tell you that you owed her?" Margaret nodded. "She did." I felt something inside me shift. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But understanding. For the first time I could see where the green notebook had begun. Margaret hadn't invented the idea that children owed parents. Someone had handed that belief to her when she was young and frightened. She had carried it for decades. Then she had handed it to me. Leah asked, "Did you believe you were doing for Nora what your mother had done for you?" Margaret answered, "I was teaching her how life works." I looked down at my hands. There it was, the cycle. She had mistaken survival for wisdom. She had taken the lesson that hurt her and called it love. I wanted to feel sorry for her. Part of me did. But another part remembered being 14 and counting $40 payments, while other kids were thinking about school dances. Understanding her past didn't erase mine. Leah asked one final question. "Mrs. Bennet, do you believe a parent is entitled to collect every dollar spent raising a child?" Margaret answered, "If the child refuses to contribute, yes." My stomach tightened. Even after everything, she still believed it. When the deposition ended, I walked outside with Leah. The cold air hit my face. "I feel sorry for her," I said. Leah didn't immediately respond. "You can feel sorry for someone and still hold them accountable." I nodded. That sentence stayed with me. My mother had suffered. That was true. She had lost opportunities. She had been forced to grow up too early. That was true too. But pain explains behavior. It doesn't excuse it. If it did, every generation would simply pass its wounds to the next one and call that tradition. I looked back at the building. Somewhere inside, Margaret was probably still convinced that she was the victim. Maybe she always would be. I couldn't change that. What I could change was what happened next. I didn't have to inherit her definition of family. I didn't have to turn love into debt just because she had. For the first time, I felt something close to peace in the middle of a lawsuit. I could understand where my mother's ledger came from without accepting the balance she had written beside my name. The bank records arrived 3 days later. Leah called me before she opened the file. "Nora, we have the documentation from the account." I was sitting at my desk when she said it. My hand stopped over the keyboard. The $20,000 yes. I drove to her office that afternoon. She had arranged the documents in chronological order. The first page showed the account information. The next showed Eleanor's ownership. Another identified the payable on death beneficiary. My name was there. Clearly. Directly. No Margaret. No Thomas. No family trust. No joint ownership. Nothing that supported my mother's claim. Leah pointed to the page. "This is what we needed." I stared at my name. I had seen it before, but never like this. Before Eleanor died, I had never fully understood what the account represented. I knew she had wanted to help me. I knew she had told me not to feel guilty about accepting it. But now I saw the legal record beside the memory. Eleanor had deliberately set it up. She had made a decision. She had chosen me. "Margaret doesn't have any rights to this?" I asked. Leah shook her head. "Based on these records, I don't see a basis for her to claim that the account belonged to her simply because Eleanor was her mother." I let out a slow breath. So it really was mine. Yes. I leaned back in the chair. She knew that. Leah looked at me. "What do you mean?" "My mother knew Grandma gave me the money. That's why she was angry after the funeral." I remembered the question Margaret had asked me. "What are you planning to do with the family's money?" At the time I had thought she was grieving badly. Now I understood. She wasn't asking what I would do with my grandmother's gift. She was asking what I would do with what she believed belonged to the family. I looked at the bank documents again. Suddenly I remembered the afternoon Eleanor had told me about the account. We had been sitting at her kitchen table. She had poured tea into two mismatched cups. She looked tired but peaceful. "You don't need to tell your mother everything," she had said. I had laughed. "She'll find out anyway." Eleanor had smiled sadly. "Then let her be angry." I hadn't understood. I asked why she was giving me the money. She said, "Because you need a beginning." Those words came back so clearly that my eyes filled with tears. A beginning. Not a reward, not a debt, not an investment. A beginning. Leah slid another document toward me. "There is something else." It was a statement showing the transfer after Eleanor's death. The money had gone directly to my account. I had used it years later toward the purchase of Willow Lane. Every step was documented. "This makes the timeline very clean," Leah said. "Eleanor established the account. You were the beneficiary. The funds transferred to you. You used your own money and those funds toward the house. Your parents did not contribute to the purchase." I nodded. Then I whispered. "My mother said, Grandma's money was family money." Leah looked at me. "That isn't how ownership works." I smiled faintly. "I know." Then I stopped smiling. "But it was never really about ownership, was it?" Leah waited. "It was about control." She didn't disagree. I left her office carrying copies of the documents. That evening I placed them beside Eleanor's old teacup. I touched the rim with my finger. I thought about how often I had felt guilty for accepting that $20,000. I had wondered whether I was taking something I didn't deserve. My mother had made sure I questioned every gift. Eleanor had tried to teach me the opposite. I opened the drawer where I kept her letter. I didn't read it yet. I wasn't ready. Instead, I looked at the bank statement again. $20,000. A number that had once felt enormous. Now it seemed almost symbolic. My grandmother hadn't given me enough money to erase every problem. She had given me enough to take one step away from the life I had been trapped in. That was what this money had done. It became part of the down payment on the house. It became part of the first place I could call mine. My mother wanted to turn that money into another debt. Eleanor had intended it as freedom. The difference was everything. Later that night, Leah called again. "Nora, there's one thing I want you to remember. Don't let their definition of the money become your definition of it." I looked around my quiet house. The flowers outside were beginning to bloom. Jasper was curled up beside the heater. Eleanor's teacup sat on the windowsill. For the first time I understood what my grandmother had actually left me. It wasn't simply $20,000. It was permission to stop measuring my worth by what I owed. My mother had spent my childhood keeping score. Eleanor had spent her final years trying to erase the scorecard. And now, sitting alone in the house that money had helped me buy, I finally understood the message she had been trying to give me. Some gifts are not meant to be repaid. They are meant to help you become free. The settlement offer arrived on a Tuesday morning in an email from Leah, and when I read the number, I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because after everything Margaret had claimed I owed her, after the $170,000 demand the house, the so-called family contribution, she was suddenly willing to make the entire thing disappear for $40,000. Leah called me 10 minutes later. "Before you react, read everything she said." I opened the attachment again. $40,000. I would pay it. Margaret would dismiss the lawsuit. The claim against my house would disappear. No trial, no more depositions, no more discovery requests digging through the most painful parts of my childhood. No more relatives calling me with questions they had already decided the answers to. It was almost tempting enough to hurt. "What do you think I asked?" Leah paused. "I think you need to decide what $40,000 means to you." I sat at my kitchen table and opened my banking app. I started doing what I had always done when I was scared. I made a ledger. $40,000. My emergency savings would take the first hit, then the money I had been setting aside for the roof. The roof wasn't leaking yet, but anyone who owned an older house in Ohio knew that not leaking yet wasn't the same as fine. I looked at the balance in my business account. Bennett Ledger Services wasn't some giant accounting firm. It was my livelihood. It paid my mortgage, utilities, insurance, groceries, and everything else that came with being responsible for myself. $40,000 wouldn't destroy me, but it would set me back years. I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred. Then I imagined something else. No more legal bills. No more waking up at 2 in the morning wondering whether Margaret would find another way to reach me. No more seeing the word litigation attached to my home. I could pay the $40,000, close the door, and move on. Maybe that was what adults did. Maybe peace sometimes had a price. That afternoon I called Leah again. "If I pay, does that mean I admit she was right?" I asked. "Not necessarily," she said carefully. "A settlement can resolve a dispute without deciding who was right, but you need to understand what you're agreeing to." I knew what she meant. The legal language might say nothing more than settlement, but emotionally it felt different. Margaret had spent my childhood teaching me that every kindness had a price. Every meal had a number. Every pair of shoes could become evidence. Every dollar could become a debt. Now she was offering me a chance to hand over $40,000 and call the account closed. I walked into my bedroom and opened the closet. The banker box was still there. I pulled it down and looked at the folders inside. Pay stubs, tax returns, closing documents, receipts. Records of a life I had built one careful piece at a time. Then I looked through the window at the backyard. The flowers were beginning to fade as summer moved toward fall. I had planted them myself. I had chosen the house myself. I had paid the mortgage myself. I had never asked Margaret for money. Still, a tiny voice inside me whispered, "Just pay her. Be done." For the first time since the lawsuit began, I wasn't afraid of losing the case. I was afraid of losing my peace. That night, I calculated everything again. $40,000. I could survive it. That was the dangerous part. If Margaret had demanded $400,000, I would have laughed her out of the room. But $40,000 was just close enough to affordability to become a psychological trap. I finally understood something I wished I had learned much earlier. Sometimes the most expensive decision isn't the one that costs the most money. It's the one that teaches someone they can keep charging you. I called Leah the next morning. "I need one more day," I told her. "Take it," she said. I hung up and sat alone at my kitchen table. The settlement document was still open on my laptop. My finger hovered over the trackpad. I was closer to saying yes than I wanted to admit. Then I remembered my grandmother's voice. Not the words yet, just the warmth of it. And suddenly I knew exactly where I needed to look. I found the letter at the bottom of a small wooden box I had kept for years without opening very often. Eleanor had given me the box during one of our Sunday phone calls, telling me there were a few things that belonged to the past. At the time I had smiled and put it away. Now my hands shook as I opened it. Inside were photographs, an old recipe card, a faded birthday card, and one folded sheet of paper with my name written across the front. Nora. I knew the handwriting immediately. I unfolded it slowly. The first line made my chest tighten. "My sweet Nora. If you are reading this, I am probably no longer here to say these things myself." I stopped. I had to breathe before I could continue. Eleanor wrote about Margaret, not with hatred, not even with anger. She wrote about a woman who had learned very young that love could disappear when money became scarce. She wrote about sacrifice fear and the way Margaret had turned survival into a rule she expected everyone else to follow. Then Eleanor wrote something that I had never expected to see. "It was never your debt, Nora. It was mine. Don't pay it twice." I read that sentence 3 times, then a fourth. My eyes filled with tears. For years I had thought Eleanor's $20,000 was simply an inheritance. Something nice she had left me. Something that helped me buy my house. But suddenly I understood that she had known exactly what that money could mean. It wasn't payment for my childhood. It wasn't a family asset. It wasn't an unfinished balance. It was freedom. Eleanor had spent years watching Margaret measure love in dollars, and somehow she had understood that I needed one thing more than money. I needed a way to stop measuring myself that way. I called Leah. I found something, I said. My voice cracked. What is it? A letter from my grandmother. I read the important line to her. There was silence on the other end. Then Leah said, "That sounds like something you needed to hear." I looked at the settlement offer sitting on my desk. $40,000. I imagined transferring the money. I imagined Margaret receiving it. I imagined the lawsuit disappearing. And then I imagined the message underneath that transaction. Maybe it wouldn't legally mean she was right, but to me it would feel like I had finally accepted the family ledger. I would be saying in the only language Margaret seemed to understand, "Yes, I owed you something. I couldn't do it. I don't want the settlement," I told Leah. She didn't celebrate. She didn't tell me I was brave. She simply asked, "Are you sure?" I looked down at Eleanor's handwriting. "Yes, then we'll keep fighting." I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the settlement document. For the first time, the $40,000 didn't look like a price for peace. It looked like the final test of whether I believed my own life belonged to me. That realization changed something inside me. I had spent 14 years building a life away from my parents. But emotionally, some part of me was still standing in that old house at 18, waiting for Margaret to tell me whether I had paid enough. I had worked harder than necessary, saved more than necessary, kept records of everything, apologized when I didn't need to, explained myself when nobody had earned an explanation. I thought independence meant proving I could survive without them. Eleanor's letter showed me something deeper. Independence meant understanding that survival wasn't the same thing as freedom. I called Leah again later that afternoon. "Let's fight it," I said. "All the way." "Okay," she replied. "Then we prepare." I placed the letter back in the wooden box, but I didn't put it away. I kept it beside me while I worked that evening. Every time fear returned, I read those 7 words again. Don't pay it twice. I finally understood what Eleanor had meant. Margaret believed I owed her because she had paid to raise me. Eleanor believed she had already paid the price of allowing Margaret's pain to continue through another generation. And now the choice was mine. I could pass the debt forward, or I could end it with me. The next morning I emailed Leah one sentence: "Reject the settlement." Then I closed my laptop. For the first time since Margaret appeared at my door, I wasn't waiting for my mother to decide what happened next. I had decided. Once I rejected the $40,000 settlement, everything changed. Not outside my house, not at work, not in the quiet streets of Ashford. The world looked exactly the same, but inside the case the posture shifted. Until then I had felt like someone standing in front of a door, while another person kept trying to force it open. Now Leah was helping me reinforce the entire house. "We're going to file for summary judgment," she told me. "We're going to ask the court to decide that there isn't a genuine legal basis for Margaret's claims to continue." I nodded, but the legal phrase didn't fully sink in until she started laying the evidence across her conference table. She placed the documents in separate stacks. No written promise, no transfer agreement, no deed, no mortgage payment from Margaret, no bank transfer showing Margaret had invested in my house, no document saying the $20,000 belonged to the family. Then she placed the pod account records on top. "This is important," she said. "Your grandmother named you directly." I looked at the pages. My name was there. Nora Bennett, beneficiary. The account had never belonged to Margaret. The money had never passed through her hands. It had gone directly to me after Eleanor's death, according to the account's beneficiary designation. Then came my house closing documents. Purchase price, $170,000. Down payment, $34,000. My $20,000 inheritance. My $14,000 savings. Mortgage for the remainder. Every number matched. Every signature was mine. I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Control. Not victory. Not yet. But control. Leah tapped the stack of Margaret's notebook pages. "This is the part I want the judge to see clearly," she said. "Her records may prove she spent money raising you. They don't prove she purchased an ownership interest in your adult home." I stared at the words. It sounded so obvious when Leah said it. Yet Margaret had managed to make me question it. That was her greatest strength. She didn't need the facts to be complicated. She only needed to repeat her version of them often enough that everyone around her became exhausted trying to challenge it. We worked late that afternoon. Leah drafted the motion. I reviewed declarations and answered questions. Some were easy. Some dragged me back into memories I had spent years burying. When did you leave your parents' home? What financial support did your parents provide after you left? Did you ever promise to reimburse them? Did Margaret ever contribute to the purchase of your property? Had you ever signed an agreement concerning the home? No. 5 simple answers. 14 years of history reduced to checkboxes and sworn statements. It was strange. For most of my life, I had believed my story was too complicated to explain. But when the facts were placed in order, the pattern became painfully simple. I left at 18. I built my own income. I received a specific inheritance from Eleanor. I bought a house with documented funds. I never promised Margaret ownership. I never signed a family debt agreement. I never asked her to invest in my property. The case wasn't complicated because of the evidence. It was complicated because of the emotional weight Margaret had attached to it. The motion went out. Then came the waiting. I tried to work normally. I answered client emails. I reconciled accounts. I went grocery shopping. But every time my phone buzzed, my stomach tightened. I hated how much power a lawsuit could have over ordinary moments. A notification could ruin breakfast. An envelope could change the entire mood of a day. One evening, Megan stopped by with coffee. She looked at the stacks of documents on my dining room table. You know, she said, most people keep receipts for tax season. You apparently keep receipts for the apocalypse. I laughed despite myself. I told you. Doomsday Library. She looked at me for a moment. Maybe your mother taught you to keep records because she wanted you afraid. But now those records are protecting you. I hadn't thought of it that way. The same habit I had developed because I was terrified of being accused of owing someone had become the thing proving I didn't. That night I sat alone and looked at the evidence. Margaret had her green notebook. I had my banker box. Hers documented what she believed I owed. Mine documented what I had actually built. I finally understood that truth doesn't always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it arrives as a bank statement, a signed deed, a receipt, a tax return, a name printed beside a beneficiary designation. Ordinary pieces of paper can become powerful when someone tries to rewrite your life. A week later, Leah called. The court has scheduled the hearing. My heart dropped. When she gave me the date, I wrote it down. Then I closed my notebook. I was still scared, but I wasn't hiding anymore. I was ready to let the evidence speak. The courtroom was colder than I expected. I sat beside Leah with my hands folded tightly in my lap, trying not to look across the room. But I looked anyway. Margaret was sitting beside her attorney, wearing the same expression she had worn at my front door. Calm, certain, almost offended that anyone would question her. Thomas sat behind her. He looked older than he had when I left home. His shoulders were rounded, his hands clasped together, his eyes fixed on the floor. I wondered if he remembered that night. The bus, my 2 bags, the $100 I had hidden, the way he had told me it would be easier if I simply gave Margaret what she wanted. Leah leaned toward me. Breathe, she whispered. Let the documents do the work. The hearing began. Margaret's attorney argued that she had financially supported me for years and that it would be unfair for me to retain a property purchased partly with money originating from the family. Leah responded with the records. She walked the court through the POD account. She explained the beneficiary designation. She presented my closing documents. She showed the mortgage records. She pointed out that Margaret had never signed the deed, never made mortgage payments, and never entered a written agreement giving her an ownership interest. Then the judge asked to see the green notebook. My stomach tightened. Margaret's attorney handed it forward. The judge opened it carefully. Page after page. Numbers, dates, descriptions, shoes, food, medical expenses, school supplies, room and board. Then the judge stopped. He looked at one entry for several seconds. Room and board, he read. Age 14. Collected. Margaret's attorney shifted in his chair. The judge looked up. Ms. Bennett, is this your handwriting? Margaret smiled slightly. Yes, Your Honor. I've always kept fair books. I felt something cold move through me. Fair books. That phrase had followed me since childhood. I had once believed it meant responsibility. Now I understood that Margaret had built an entire philosophy around it. The judge turned another page. You began charging room and board while your daughter was a minor. Margaret nodded. I was teaching her responsibility. Leah didn't move. Neither did I. The judge continued looking through the notebook. And these amounts are included in the balance you claim she owes you. Margaret's attorney answered carefully. They form part of the financial history underlying the claim, Your Honor. The judge looked directly at Margaret. Do you believe your daughter owes you for the cost of raising her? Margaret didn't hesitate. Of course. Children are an investment. The courtroom went completely silent. I heard the faint hum of the air conditioning. Someone shifted in a wooden chair behind me. Thomas finally lifted his head. Margaret seemed confused by the reaction. She looked almost proud of the sentence. The judge stared at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, That may be the saddest sentence I've heard in this courtroom. Margaret's face changed. For the first time, the certainty disappeared. I looked down at my hands. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't smiling. I was thinking about 14-year-old me sitting at a kitchen table while my mother counted out the money I had earned at my first job. I remembered the receipt. $40, room and board. I remembered wondering how much it would cost to belong to my own family. Suddenly, the courtroom wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It was the place where that little girl finally got to hear an adult say what she had never been allowed to say. The judge reviewed the legal arguments and the evidence again. He questioned Margaret's attorney about the alleged promise I had supposedly made. There was no written agreement, no witness who could identify a specific promise concerning the house, no document connecting the childhood expenses to ownership of an adult property. The notebook showed Margaret's belief that I owed her money. It didn't create a legal right to my home. Leah answered each question calmly. I watched her and realized how different this felt from my childhood. Back then, Margaret had controlled the conversation by speaking louder, repeating herself, and making me feel guilty for asking questions. Here, emotion wasn't enough. Claims needed evidence. Words needed support. A story needed facts. When the hearing ended, the judge said he would issue his ruling after reviewing the remaining materials. I walked outside with Leah. Sunlight hit my face, and for a moment I couldn't move. Are you okay? Leah asked. I nodded slowly. I think so. Then I looked back at the courthouse doors. I had spent years believing I needed to prove that I wasn't a bad daughter. Today, for the first time, I realized I didn't have to prove that at all. I only had to prove what was legally true, and the evidence had already begun speaking for me. The ruling came on a gray Thursday morning. I was sitting at my desk when Leah called. I knew before she said anything. Somehow I knew. Nora, she said. The judge granted the motion. I closed my eyes. For several seconds I couldn't speak. What does that mean exactly? I finally asked. Leah explained that the court had rejected Margaret's claims against my property. There was no enforceable agreement giving Margaret an ownership interest. The evidence didn't establish the alleged promise or family contribution she had claimed. The $20,000 from Eleanor belonged to me. My house remained mine. The lease pendants could be released, which meant the cloud hanging over the property could finally be removed. I listened to every word, but my mind kept returning to one sentence. My house remained mine. I looked around my office. The old desk, the shelves, the framed certificate from when I first started Bennett Ledger Services, the coffee mug Megan had given me. None of those things were impressive. None were expensive, but they were mine. I had built this life slowly. There had been no inheritance waiting for me except Eleanor's $20,000. No wealthy parents, no safety net, no family business, just work, mistakes, long nights, small victories. I had earned every ordinary part of it. When the call ended, I didn't cheer. I didn't call Megan immediately. I simply put my head down on the desk and cried. I cried harder than I had expected, not because I had won, because I suddenly understood what I had been fighting for. It wasn't really the house. The house was important, but it was only the physical symbol of something much larger. I had spent my entire adult life trying to prove that leaving home hadn't made me selfish, that refusing Margaret's demands didn't make me ungrateful, that accepting Eleanor's inheritance didn't make me greedy, that wanting a peaceful life didn't make me a bad daughter. I had been trying to defend myself against an accusation that had existed long before the lawsuit, and now I finally understood something painful and liberating. I didn't need my mother's permission to be a good person. I didn't need her ledger to tell me what I was worth. I didn't need to keep earning forgiveness for leaving a situation that had hurt me. I picked up Eleanor's letter and read the line again. "Don't pay it twice." I whispered I didn't. For the first time, those words felt like an answer. Later that afternoon, I drove to the courthouse to complete the paperwork connected to the judgment. When I stepped outside, I noticed something strange. The sky was still gray, but I wasn't afraid of it anymore. My phone buzzed. It was Margaret. I stared at her name. I didn't answer. Then another message arrived. "You have destroyed this family." I read it once. Then again. My chest tightened, but not with guilt this time, with exhaustion. A few minutes later, another message came. "Your grandmother would be ashamed of you." That one hurt. Margaret knew exactly where to place the knife. I put the phone face down. I wanted to call Leah. I wanted to ask whether I should respond. Instead, I called Megan. She answered immediately. "Tell me," she said. I started crying before I could speak. I won. There was silence. Then she said, "I know. How you sound different." I laughed through my tears. "I feel different." That evening I went home and stood in the kitchen. The house was quiet. The gray cat rubbed against my ankle. I looked at the little teacup sitting by the window. Eleanor's teacup. The one I had placed there 3 years earlier when I bought the house. I touched its rim and remembered the thought I had had that day. Paid in full. I had been wrong about what that meant. It hadn't meant I had finally paid enough. It meant I had finally stopped keeping score. But my peace lasted only a few days. Margaret wasn't finished. So began calling relatives. She told Susan that the judge had taken everything away from the family. She told Thomas that I had humiliated them. She insisted that the lawsuit had never been about money. It was about respect. Then she started saying that I had stolen Eleanor's money, even though the court records showed otherwise. I began to understand that losing in court hadn't changed Margaret's story. It had only made her more desperate to tell it. The civil battle was over, but the family battle was just beginning. And this time, the person caught in the middle wasn't my grandmother. It was my father. Thomas had spent his entire life avoiding conflict, telling everyone that keeping quiet was easier. Now Margaret was pushing him toward a choice he had avoided for decades. I didn't know it yet, but the next time I saw my father, there would be no judge between us. No lawyers, no documents. Just years of silence, anger, and one final consequence of the family ledger Margaret had built. For the first few days after the judge ruled in my favor, I slept better than I had slept in years. The lis pendens was being cleared, my house was still mine, and for the first time since my mother appeared at my door, I could breathe without wondering what document she might have waiting for me next. I thought winning the case would make everything quiet. I was wrong. Margaret had lost the lawsuit, but she had not accepted what the verdict meant. She called Thomas almost every night, and according to him, she barely slept. She took everything from us, he told me during our first phone call after the judgment. I was sitting at my kitchen table with Eleanor's teacup beside me when I heard those words. "What did I take?" I asked. Thomas sighed. "You know what she means." "No, Dad. I really don't." He was quiet for several seconds. Then he said the sentence I had heard when I was 18, the sentence that had followed me for half my life. "Just give her what she wants, Nora. It's easier." Something inside me went still. I looked around my kitchen at the bills I had paid, the mortgage. I had carried the flowers I had planted, the little gray cat sleeping in the window, and the cup my grandmother had left behind. Easier for who, Dad? I asked. Thomas didn't answer. For Mom, I continued. For you? Or for me? Still nothing. That silence told me more than any confession could have. My father had spent 40 years avoiding conflict, and every time he chose silence, Margaret learned that she could push a little harder. When I was 14, he hadn't stopped the $40 weekly charge. When I was 18, he hadn't stopped her from demanding my paycheck. And now, after a judge had rejected her claim to my house, he was asking me to make her comfortable again. I can't do this anymore, I said quietly. I can't keep paying for peace with things that belong to me. Thomas finally spoke. She's your mother. I closed my eyes. And you're my father. He said nothing. I needed you to be my father when I was 18, I said, not someone who told me it was easier to give in. His breathing changed on the other end of the line. For a moment I thought he might apologize. He didn't. He simply said, I don't know what you want me to do. I wanted you to protect me, I answered. Now I just want you to leave me alone. I ended the call before he could respond. I cried afterward, which surprised me. I wasn't crying because I wanted him back. I was crying because I finally understood that sometimes the hardest grief isn't losing someone. It's realizing they were never going to become the person you needed them to be. A few weeks later, I received notice that I needed to return to the courthouse to complete the final administrative steps connected to the civil judgment and the release of the property filing. It wasn't another trial. It was paperwork, signatures, and the final clearing of the cloud that had been hanging over my house. I almost asked Leah to handle everything for me, but I decided to go myself. I wanted to walk into that building without being afraid. That morning, I parked across the street and sat in my car for nearly 5 minutes. My hands were tight around the steering wheel. I reminded myself that I had done nothing wrong. I had not stolen anything. I had not broken a promise. I had not taken money that belonged to my family. I had simply refused to surrender something I had worked for. I finally got out and crossed the street. I had just reached the courthouse entrance when I saw him. Thomas was standing near the steps, alone. His shoulders looked smaller than I remembered. For 1 second I thought he had come to apologize. Then he looked at me, and I saw the same conflict in his face that had been there my entire childhood. Fear of Margaret, fear of me, fear of choosing. He took 1 step toward me. Nora, he said. I stopped. Why are you here, Dad? He looked past me toward the courthouse doors. We need to talk. My stomach tightened. About what? He swallowed. About your mother. Of course. It was always about my mother. I should have walked away. Instead, I stayed. And within minutes, I would learn that losing a lawsuit had not ended Margaret's campaign. It had only removed the legal shield she had been hiding behind. Thomas didn't say much at first. He stood a few feet away from me on the courthouse steps, rubbing his hands together like he was trying to warm them, even though the morning wasn't cold. Your mother thinks the judge got it wrong, he finally said. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about it. The judge heard the evidence, Dad. She doesn't care about that. I know. He looked down. She says the house should have been hers. It wasn't hers. She says Grandma's money was family money. It wasn't. She says you abandoned us. I stared at him. You really came here to repeat all of this? He shook his head. I'm trying to keep things from getting worse. Things are already worse because nobody ever stopped her. His face hardened. You don't understand what it's like being married to your mother. The words stunned me. For years I had wondered whether he knew what Margaret was doing. Now, standing on those courthouse steps, he had finally admitted something without actually admitting it. Then why did you keep asking me to give in? I asked. Thomas looked toward the street. Because when I didn't, things got worse at home. I felt something break inside me, not from anger, but from clarity. So you made them worse for me instead. He didn't answer. Before either of us could say anything else, I heard Margaret's voice behind me. There she is. I turned. She was walking toward us with her purse tucked beneath one arm, her expression controlled and almost calm. That calm frightened me more than shouting would have. Mom, I said. What are you doing here? I'm here because your father couldn't finish a simple conversation. She looked at Thomas. You were supposed to bring her to her senses. I shook my head. There is nothing left to discuss. Margaret's eyes narrowed. There is always something left to discuss when family has been robbed. I didn't rob you. You took Grandma's money. She left it to me. You took the house. I bought it. You took our chance to retire. That was never my responsibility. Margaret stepped closer. Everything we did for you was our responsibility. Everything you owe us is yours. My chest tightened. I had heard versions of those words since I was a child, but hearing them outside the courtroom made them sound even more frightening. I don't owe you my house, I said. I don't owe you my savings. And I don't owe you the rest of my life. Margaret turned toward Thomas. See, she doesn't care about us. Thomas's jaw tightened. Margaret, stop. She stared at him. Stop what? Just stop. You heard her. She thinks we're nothing. That's not what I said, I interrupted. You don't get to decide what I feel anymore. Margaret stepped closer to me. You always were selfish. Something in Thomas snapped. Enough, he shouted. People near the entrance turned to look. Margaret flinched, then immediately attacked him with the same coldness she had used on me. After everything I've done for you. Thomas moved toward her. I'm done. She stepped back. You're choosing her. I'm choosing not to do this anymore. Then Margaret pointed at me. She took everything from us. Thomas turned toward me, breathing heavily. I saw anger, fear, humiliation, and years of bottled-up resentment crossing his face. Dad, I said carefully, please just go home. He took a step toward me. You think you won? This isn't about winning. You always think you're better than us. I don't. He moved closer. I stepped back. Dad, stop. My heel caught the edge of the step. I reached for the railing, but Thomas grabbed my arm. I tried to pull free. Let go of me. In the confusion, my foot slipped. I fell hard against the stone steps, catching myself with my hand. Pain shot through my wrist and elbow so sharply that for a moment I couldn't breathe. Someone shouted. Then security officers rushed through the courthouse doors. Deputies followed seconds later. Thomas immediately stepped back. Margaret didn't move toward me. She didn't ask if I was hurt. She simply stood there and said, "This is a family matter." I looked up at her from the steps, holding my wrist against my chest. And for the first time in my life, I understood exactly what those words meant. Family matter had always been the phrase used to tell me to stay quiet. It had been used to excuse my mother's control, my father's silence, and every demand I was expected to accept without question. But now there were witnesses, there were security cameras, there were deputies standing between us, there was a courthouse behind me, and there was pain in my wrist that I couldn't explain away. A deputy crouched beside me and asked, "Ma'am, are you hurt?" I nodded. Yes. The answer came out quietly, but it was the clearest thing I had said all day. I was hurt. And this time, I wasn't going to pretend I wasn't. My wrist wasn't broken, but I had a deep bruise along the side of my hand and a swollen elbow that made even simple movements painful. The deputies took statements. Security preserved the footage. I answered every question as clearly as I could, even when my voice shook. I kept thinking about Margaret's words. This is a family matter. She had said them like family was supposed to make what happened less serious. But the truth was the opposite. The fact that Thomas was my father didn't make what happened acceptable. The fact that Margaret was my mother didn't erase it. Leah helped me understand what came next. There would be reports, court dates, and protective measures. Don't make any decisions because you feel guilty, she told me. Make them because they're safe and right for you. I nodded, but I didn't tell her how complicated that felt. Anger was easy. Fear was easy. Grief was harder. 2 days later, Margaret called. I stared at her name on my phone for almost a full minute before letting it go to voicemail. When I finally listened, her voice sounded completely different from the woman who had stood on the courthouse steps. Soft. Almost tender. Nora, sweetheart, I know you're upset. Your father lost his temper and everything got out of hand. Nobody wanted this. I closed my eyes. Then she continued. You don't have to make this bigger than it is. You can tell them you don't want to testify. You can withdraw the protection order. We can forget the legal costs. We can sit down like a family. Sunday dinner. Just the four of us. We'll call it even. I replayed that last sentence twice. We'll call it even. For a moment I imagined it. A table, 4 plates, my mother serving dinner, my father sitting quietly. No lawyers, no courthouse, no ledgers. Maybe she would finally say she was sorry. Maybe my father would finally say he should have protected me. Maybe after 14 years, I could have the mother I had spent my childhood wishing for. That was the dangerous part. Margaret wasn't offering me peace. She was offering me the possibility of finally receiving something I had wanted for decades. I sat on the edge of my bed and cried. Not because I believed her, because some small part of me still wanted to. I hated that part of myself. Then I remembered Eleanor. I walked to the drawer where I kept the letter she had left me. The paper was soft from being handled so many times. I unfolded it carefully and read the words again. It was never your debt, Nora. It was mine. Don't pay it twice. I read them slowly. Then I looked at the voicemail transcript on my phone. Margaret wasn't asking me to forgive her. She was asking me to give something up so she could avoid consequences. Again, I was being asked to pay for someone else's choices. This time the currency wasn't money. It was my safety. I pressed my thumb against the screen and saved the voicemail to a secure folder. Then I backed it up. I knew exactly why I was doing it. I wasn't trying to punish my mother. I wasn't trying to destroy my father. I was preserving the truth. There is a difference between revenge and accountability, and I had spent years confusing the two because my family taught me that setting boundaries was cruelty. I called Leah. I listened to the voicemail I said, and she asked, "I'm going to cooperate." There was a pause. "Are you sure?" "Yes." My voice was steadier now. "I'm not doing this because I hate them. Why are you doing it?" I looked at Eleanor's letter. "Because I don't want what happened to become another family secret." Leah didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "That's your decision." That night, I put the letter back in its envelope and placed it beside the banker box where I kept my most important records. I didn't feel victorious. I felt exhausted. But beneath the exhaustion was something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Certainty. My mother had spent years teaching me that love meant paying. My father had taught me that peace meant surrendering. Eleanor had taught me something different. Love could exist without an invoice. And protecting myself didn't make me heartless. It meant I was finally taking responsibility for the one person my family had taught me to abandon myself. The courtroom felt different the second time I entered it. During the civil case, I had walked in carrying fear that I might lose my home. This time I walked in carrying something heavier, the knowledge that my father had hurt me on those courthouse steps, and that my mother had stood there and called it a family matter. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to see anyone destroyed. I wanted the truth to remain the truth even when the truth was ugly. When I took the stand, my hands were cold. I looked toward the judge and reminded myself to breathe. The questions began with the courthouse incident, but eventually they moved backward. "Had you experienced conflict with your parents before?" the attorney asked. I swallowed. "Yes." "How far back years?" I told them about being 14 and being handed a weekly bill for room and board. I explained the green notebook. I described the receipts my mother wrote while I was still a minor. I talked about being 18, being told to give up college and turn over most of my paycheck because I had accumulated what Margaret called a raising balance. Then I told them about the night I left. 2 bags, my birth certificate, $1,100 hidden away because I knew I might need it. I told them about the bus leaving town and how terrified I was. I didn't make myself sound braver than I had been. I wasn't brave. I was 18 and scared. I simply knew I couldn't stay. I told them about the 14 years without contact. I told them about finding Eleanor again when I was 25, and how she became the first family member who asked whether I was happy instead of asking what I could contribute. I told them about the $20,000 she left me, and how that money eventually helped me buy my house. Then came the lawsuit. the $170,000 demand, the claim that Grandma's money belonged to the family, the notebook, the deposition, the settlement offer, and finally the courthouse steps. Margaret sat behind the opposing side listening. Every once in a while I saw her shake her head. When her attorney questioned me, the tone changed. "You agree that your parents spent money raising you?" "Yes," I said. "You agree they made sacrifices?" "I'm sure they did. And yet you refused to compensate them." I looked at him. I was their child, not their investment account. Margaret shifted in her seat. Later when she spoke, she returned to the same language she had used for years. She said I owed her. She said I had taken the family money. She said the house represented everything she had lost. She said my refusal to cooperate had pushed Thomas over the edge. I listened without interrupting. That was one of the hardest things I had ever done. I wanted to defend every accusation. I wanted to list every dollar, every receipt, every night I had worked. But I finally understood that I didn't have to prove every part of my life to someone determined not to see it. When it was my turn to speak again, I looked toward the judge. "This isn't revenge," I said. "It's the first true thing my family has ever put in writing." The courtroom became completely silent. I took a breath. For years, everything was private. Everything was a family matter. Every demand happened behind closed doors. Every debt existed only because my mother said it did. But this time there are records. There are witnesses. There is a report. There is a truth that doesn't depend on whether my family agrees with it. I looked toward my mother. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "Love isn't alone, Mom," I said softly. "Love has to include respect. It has to include safety. And it cannot require someone to surrender themselves just to prove they're a good child." The court later imposed probation and counseling requirements on Thomas, along with a no-contact order protecting me. There were additional conditions connected to the incident, but what mattered most to me wasn't the punishment. It was the boundary. Thomas would no longer be able to walk into my life simply because he was my father. Margaret would no longer be able to use family gatherings as a way to pull me back into the same cycle. After the hearing, I stood outside the courthouse alone. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt strangely empty. Then I realized why. For years I had imagined that one day I would finally win against my mother. But I hadn't won against her. I had finally stopped playing her game. There was a difference. I wasn't going to count what she owed me. I wasn't going to count what I owed her. I wasn't going to keep a ledger of every injury and call it justice. I was simply going to live differently. For the first time, I understood that a boundary doesn't have to be angry to be firm. Sometimes the strongest no is the quietest one. I walked to my car, placed Eleanor's letter carefully in my bag, and drove home. I didn't look back at the courthouse. I didn't need to. The final ledger was no longer something my family kept. It was something I had finally closed. I used to think freedom would feel dramatic. I thought there would be some huge moment when I walked away from my mother, won my house, and finally stopped being afraid. But the truth was much quieter than that. Freedom felt like waking up one morning and realizing I didn't check my phone before I checked the weather. It felt like opening my front door without wondering who might be standing there. It felt like paying my bills without hearing my mother's voice in the back of my mind, asking what I owed her next. I had spent most of my life keeping records. I kept receipts, bank statements, contracts, tax returns, and every document I thought might someday prove I was telling the truth. But I eventually realized there was another ledger I had been carrying, the one inside my head. I had been recording every mistake I made, every time I disappointed someone, every dollar I had ever received from my family. I thought if I could balance that ledger perfectly, maybe I would finally deserve to be loved. I was wrong. Love isn't something a child earns by being profitable. And being grateful for what a parent provided does not mean surrendering your entire life as payment. My mother had suffered when she was young. I understood that more clearly after hearing her story. But understanding someone's pain doesn't require accepting the damage they cause. Pain can explain a person's behavior. It cannot excuse it. That was one of the hardest lessons I ever learned. Another came from my grandmother. Eleanor never asked what I earned. She never asked what I could give her back. She simply asked whether I was happy. That question stayed with me long after she was gone. So when Ethan came to me and asked for help understanding money, college expenses, and financial aid, I knew exactly what I wanted to teach him. I didn't teach him that children owe their parents. I taught him that responsible adults should learn how money works so they can build lives they choose. I wanted him to understand that helping families should come from love, not fear. And maybe that was the real ending to my story. Not defeating my mother, not winning a lawsuit, not keeping a house worth $235,000. It was refusing to pass the same wound to someone younger. I took the green notebook and placed it inside the banker box. I didn't burn it. I didn't destroy it. I simply put it away. Some things don't need revenge. They just need to stop controlling you. Then I walked to the window and looked at Eleanor's old teacup sitting where I had kept it for years. Outside, the flowers were beginning to bloom again. I opened my garden journal and wrote one sentence: April. The flowers came back on their own, and for the first time I understood exactly what that meant. I had spent years believing everything beautiful had to be earned. But some things simply grow when you finally give them room. If you've ever been made to feel like you owed someone your happiness, your money, or your entire life because they once helped you, I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe love should ever come with a price tag? Share your experience or perspective in the comments. And if this story touched you, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss the next story. Sometimes the stories that stay with us longest are the ones that remind us of something we already knew deep down: love should never be an invoice.